Uh, Good morning, everyone. So today we have with us Tristan McCowan. Tristan is a professor of international education at UCL Institute of Education in London, and is also an editor of the journal Compare. His work focuses on the areas of access and quality of higher education, alternative and innovative universities, citizenship education, and human rights, and covers a broad range of contexts, particularly Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. Tristan had worked, as far as I know, a lot also in Brazil, and is fluent in Portuguese, but because we have a mixed audience today, he will use his mother tongue, that is English. So he's also author of several let me just He's also author of several articles and books focused on higher education, indigenous education, citizenship education, and education as human rights. Today he is here to talk about his latest book, his higher education and sustainable development goals. And we're looking forward to you, Tristan. No, with no further delays, I'll pass to you. Just a quick note, just housekeeping rules. So we'll have Tristan, and then on the end we'll have a Q&A with everyone. The people who are online want to pose questions, please on the chat put an X or some words saying that want to pose questions, and then I'll let you jump in. So thanks a lot, everyone, to be here. So Tristan, up to you.
Thank you very much, Rui, and thank you for the introduction. And it's great to be with you. And I hope everything's all right with her children learning from home. I've certainly had that myself for a while, and we're all getting used to very different ways of doing things and learning things that we probably haven't thought about for decades. It's great to engage with you all on this African Studies master's course and others who might be joining us as well. The course sounds fascinating, and I look forward to engaging with you in the discussion afterwards. You know, this online form of interaction, of course, facilitates those kinds of new ways of interacting and learning. The COVID pandemic, of course, has brought a whole host of challenges for universities, new ways of doing things, in some cases financial troubles. But at the same time, it's brought some recognition to universities, at least the ones that have been involved in documenting the pandemic, developing vaccines and so forth. So there's a kind of a sort of a star university recognition that's emerged. You know, Johns Hopkins University, Oxford University, various others that have been involved in things. And it made me reflect on whether, you know, whether what the implications of this might be for thinking about universities in relation to the ongoing crises that we have in the environmental sphere, in relation to climate change and other kinds of environmental challenges. And my view that I will expand on in what we will be talking about for the next hour or so is that we need to go beyond a kind of a star university framework. Universities in any parts of the world can do groundbreaking things and create huge impact everywhere. But we can't rely purely on the breakthroughs of a few brilliant scientists in a few places. I think we need to go beyond a model of the elite universities solving everybody's problems to one in which higher education systems in all parts of the world are vibrant and are creating solutions to problems that are rooted in local places. So we'll taking that starting point from the COVID pandemic, we'll reflect back on that later. So the question that we're going to focus on specifically today relates to the role of universities in the Sustainable Development Goals, or sustainable development more broadly. And my interest in this emerged from a broader concern for the role of universities in development, generally in international development. In the new configuration that we've seen post-2000 and particularly post-2015, when the universities have a kind of a return to favor, the emphasis had been on basic education very much in the period from the 1980s, 1990s. And yet from 2000, the World Bank and other development agencies starts to talk about universities again. Universities had been seen as something of a regressive investment for lower income countries. And the big development agencies had encouraged private investment in higher education, and that had led to a reduction of public funding that was catastrophic for many countries in Africa and other parts of the world. And it's only in this more recent period that there starts to be more recognition from the human capital-based agencies like the World Bank, some of the bilaterals, that maybe higher education is a good investment after all, not only for individuals with their private returns, but also for governments. So we start to see a return of interest in higher education. And it comes into the SDGs, as we'll see more closely. But my contention is that even though we have this new emphasis on higher education and the development agencies are thinking about it, it's a very unimaginative view of what we might mean by the university. And it's led to some rather contradictory policies where higher education is given a certain role, and yet the policies in place to support it actually act against it really fulfilling that role in practice. An emphasis on affordability, on expansion of higher education at any cost is not in keeping with the kind of university that can really fulfill the broader sustainable development agenda. So those are, that's what we'll be looking at today. And I'll start off by saying something very brief about sustainable development and the SDGs. We could talk the whole session just about those, but we'll just have a very brief introduction. I'll then say something about what kind of university could fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals and help to promote them. And that's the 4 elements. So the title of the book that I published last year was Higher Education for and Beyond the Sustainable Development Goals. And the idea is that we need to think about what kind of university can promote the SDGs, but also go beyond them, because they are a limited framework. They are a significant improvement on what we have at the moment, but they're not the ultimate answer. So we do need to go beyond them, and we need to think of a university that can go beyond them as well. So the final part of the talk will be about looking at what we can use to challenge the SDGs and what kind of institution will actually help us go beyond them. So you should be able to see now some slides, which I'll show for the next few minutes. Sustainable development is a highly contested concept. It emerges particularly from the Rio Summit, the Earth Summit in the early 1990s. It really comes to the international attention. And it's now become the primary frame for development as a whole, as we've seen in the title of the Sustainable Development Goals, which emerged in 2015. What sustainable development represents is a coming together of 2 different spheres of work. One, international development, generally speaking, which comes to the fore after the Second World War. And on the other hand, the environmental concerns that emerge in the 1960s, 1970s around pollution, destruction of ecosystems, loss of biodiversity, through to acid rain and a whole host of ozone layer, a whole host of other environmental concerns, and then most recently questions of climate change. So sustainable development is the idea that you can bring together these two sets of concerns into a win-win situation, that we can simultaneously address the human dimension, the social economic questions of bringing global justice, reducing poverty, ensuring well-being for all, and protect the natural environment, ensure that we're not destroying the planet for the future generations. So there's a win-win there. You're addressing both those things at the same time. Some people, however, question whether it's really possible for us to do both of those things at the same time within the current model that we have. And certainly the United Nations endorsed version of sustainable development stays within a model, broadly speaking, of the global capitalism and the nation state system that we currently have, although albeit with some modifications and a much greater degree of regulation and some redistribution. So we have this concept, but it's important to point out that some question whether the liberal consensus around sustainable development is actually enough to fulfill those aims. So the Millennium Development Goals launched in 2000, which had 8 goals and were mainly focused on low-income countries and ensuring a basic level of well-being, make way for the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, which have a number of differences. There are more goals, there are 17 of them. There's an emphasis on measurable targets and on synergies between the different goals, avoiding working in isolation and silence. But obviously, there's a much greater emphasis on the natural environment. A large number of the goals have an explicitly environmental aspect. You've got climate action, terrestrial, aquatic systems, a whole host of different areas of the environment. But there are some other differences as well. So the SDGs are seen to apply to all different kinds of countries and not just what we might call developing countries or the global south. These are demanding for all countries, including the wealthy countries in the global north, because of the environmental challenges, but also because there is some emphasis on equality. And many of those countries have high levels of inequality. How does higher education come into the SDGs? Well, I argue that there are 3 ways that it manifests itself in the SDGs. Firstly, it's a target in itself. So Goal 4, which relates to education generally speaking, has a section that refers to equal access for all women and men to affordable and quality technical, vocational and tertiary education, including universities. So there's an explicit mention there. Now, don't be fooled into thinking that this means universal access to university globally. This is not what the goal is saying. It sounds a little bit like that, but in fact, equal access doesn't mean everybody gets to go. It just means that you can't discriminate against people of particular groups. And there's also, of course, a desire for expansion of access, but it's still quite a weak goal in terms of accessibility, and certainly falls short of the universal compulsory access that you still have as a goal for primary education. Nevertheless, it's important that there is this emphasis on access. The second role is as part of the education system as a whole. So what you can see in SDG 4 is a desire for a number of the important qualities to be promoted through the education system as a whole, which goes from primary, secondary, higher education and adult education as well. Most important of which is in relation to our topic for today is the promotion of sustainable development. So developing pro-environment, pro-social attitudes, global citizenship and so forth. But it's the third of those which will concern us most today. And that's the idea of universities as a driver for all of the SDGs. And not only through the educational role, but also through the university's role in research and innovation, community engagement, and as institutions in their own right. So it's this broader idea of universities as engines or drivers of development that we're going to look at today. And from the starting point that universities can actually be part of the problem. So partly through the direct environmental negative impacts that they might have, so carbon emissions, most obviously other kinds of environmental impacts, but also through an educational model which historically has encouraged exploitation of the natural environment and of fellow human beings as much as it has protection of them. So we're thinking of universities as potentially hugely important, but not necessarily. And then converting that to the universities being part of the solution. And this chart here, you can see International Association of Universities clusters for universities contributing to the different 17 SDGs through their different research functions. So we're moving from a negative to a positive. And question to pose next is how universities might go about that transition. And in order to do that, we're going to have a brief foray into history, perhaps not real history, an idealized history of the university in different types. And I'm just going to highlight 4 ideal types of the university to try and understand the different models that operate in higher education around the world. And I want to preface this by saying that the European tradition of higher education is not the only one. It's the one I'm going to focus on today because it's become the preeminent model globally. There were many traditions of higher education historically around the world, in different parts of the world, in China, India, the Islamic world, Mesoamerica, all of these and others as well. These were quite distinct traditions of higher learning. Most of them have become, there are a few Islamic institutions that have some continuity from their ancient forms, but in most cases, different parts of the world have adopted the European university, which emerges from 12th, 13th centuries, as their new form of higher learning. So we have a fairly homogenized global system of higher education, which, while it has some superficial differences, largely follow a common model of institution. That's another important issue that perhaps we can pick up again in the discussion. The European model of university starts with the medieval one, which is primarily a teaching institution, although it's also one for critical interpretation and debate on authoritative texts that are passed down. It's only with the emergence of the new German model of university from the early 19th century that, and particularly through the influence of Wilhelm von Humboldt, that the research function starts to enter mainstream universities. Research, of course, exists in societies, but it's not necessarily the remit of universities. Very often it takes place in scholarly societies. And with the Humboldtian university, we have the emergence of the university professor with academic freedom, combining teaching and research in their activities. Through the course of the 19th century and the 20th century, we start to have a new role for universities, which is more closely engaged with the society around it, the new professions through the Industrial Revolution. And this is what we might call the developmental university. And in fact, the notion of developmental university is one that emerges in Africa through the 60s and 70s and 80s. But I use it to mean this more engaged version of universities that comes through a number of antecedents, which we'll look at in a bit more depth. And it's service to society that's the primary characteristic of the developmental university. And the final model is the entrepreneurial one. This is the model that is most prominent in today's world. The idea here is that the university moves from having its own guaranteed sources of revenue, whether through patronage or through state funding, and it moves to being a generator of revenue through selling its services of teaching, research, and community engagement, and being creative with its marketing of itself, so it can be an income generating institution. So it's quite a shift there in the way that its functions are framed. Now, I'm not suggesting that we have a neat historical sequence of these models. What I argue instead is in fact that our contemporary universities have a combination of these models within themselves. I would say that the institution where I work currently, which is University College London, probably has all four of these models within itself. It's an entrepreneurial institution, but it also has elements of service. It has some very traditional Humboldtian aspects, but we can't discount also the community of scholars and students that emerges through the medieval one. So what we have is a kind of a competition between these models. Some universities emphasize some more than others. What I'll argue is that if we want to achieve the SDGs, what we need is a developmental model. The other models can contribute something, but it's a developmental model that is essential if we really want to fulfill all of these different goals for reducing poverty, for gender equality, for protecting the natural environment, and so forth. So we'll look a little bit more closely at the developmental model here, and it's a model that has suffered greatly in recent years. It's very much a marginalized model of university, although not extinct. To some degree, the roots of the developmental model are in the US land grant colleges that were established in the late 19th century, which had a closer relationship with agricultural communities. The idea of extension develops, but there are roots elsewhere as well. And Latin Americans who are with us today will be familiar with the reforms in the University of Cordoba in 1918 that then spread across the region and lead to a democratization of the public university, but even some influences on the Catholic universities as well, with the increased importance to the third pillar of the university, the idea of extension or public service, which to this day is very important in Latin American universities. And then we have the movement in Africa in the post-independence period. East African universities such as University of Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, Makerere, some West African universities, some in South Africa as well, where a new model of university emerges that tries to break with the ivory tower out of touch institution and works for the service of the newly developing nation for the benefit of all of its citizens and not just for the very small percentage of people that would get to go to the university. So the characteristics that you can see then of the developmental university are service, as I've said, an egalitarian approach. So the impact of the university needs to be focused primarily on those who are worst off. It's quite an applied idea of knowledge. So there is still theoretical basic research, but the emphasis is on applied knowledge and on non-academic impact. And you can see it's expressed through secondments to government, a close relationship with the state, and serving different government ministries through consultancy and so forth. There are many examples of developmental universities, not many of the early ones in Africa, be hard to describe them as such, but there is a more recent one which I think is extremely interesting, and some of you may be familiar with, which is the University for Development Studies in northern Ghana, located in the arid region with high levels of poverty in the north of the country, with an explicitly pro-poor focus. It's an important university for expanding access to people from that region and beyond. It's a public university. It has low levels of fees compared to many others. The disciplinary areas, the courses, but also the research are linked in with priorities of that region. One aspect that I find particularly interesting is that all students at the university, regardless of their the course that they're doing, spend a period each year in a local community, in a rural village, where they work with that community in some kind of development challenge or project that they're engaging in. And this is an extremely interesting initiative in terms of bringing the communities closer to the university, an intercultural dialogue. Very often the students are from different ethnic groups, but also bringing some kind of positive impact to the community. So there's a two-way relationship there with benefits on both sides. But clearly these developmental universities have challenges. It's difficult to fund if we're relying on public funding. There's always a pull back to away from the distinctive mission and towards just being a general public institution. And some of these challenges were highlighted in the early 80s by Coleman, who wrote a seminal article on the idea of the idea of the developmental university, where he highlights questions around the close links with the state and threats to autonomy, the ability of academic staff to fulfill these functions, as well as the impact on the core teaching and research functions of the university. So there were already some dangers in that early stage of the developmental university that were highlighted. I would argue that those challenges have not gone away. In fact, they've become more acute in the contemporary period. And I'll just quickly highlight what I see to be some of the big threats to the developmental university. And I think the real problem we have in the international sphere is that international agencies that are promoting the SDGs are not taking these trends seriously, where they're thinking about how to fund higher education systems in lower income countries. So the first of these is what we might call status competition. And I've taken this phrase and some of the thinking around this from my colleague Simon Marginson, who's written about this in relation to the public good function of higher education. So the most obvious manifestation of status competition is through the international university rankings. And we can see here how those rankings function. This is the Times Higher Education ranking. And you can see the top 10 on this are all from the UK and USA. You have to get down to number 14 before you get another country, Switzerland represented, and to number 20 before you get a country outside of the high income European, North American countries. And as you can imagine, there are very few universities in lower middle income countries listed in the ranking at all, let alone in the top places. So what's wrong with the rankings? Well, they do measure something, but it's not necessarily what's going to help us promote the SDGs. What they measure for the most part are elite indicators of publications and research income and reputation. There's very little on teaching. The indicators on teaching that are there are not always addressing the forms of inclusive teaching and access that we might be looking for, and almost nothing on community engagement. Okay, so it's quite a restricted set of metrics which are not I'm not saying that these institutions listed here aren't doing anything from the SDGs. Yes, they are. But it's not sufficient for ensuring the SDGs across the world. We need to think, as I said at the start, not just about the elite research of a few institutions, but high quality institutions across the globe. Now, there is another kind of ranking which Times Higher Education has brought out, which actually focuses on the SDGs. And they've got these 4 criteria here: research, stewardship, outreach, and teaching. So some of the rankings are trying to look at this, but as you can, and we've got some different institutions here. This is the top 10 for the SDGs impact ranking. They're different, but you can see all of them are in high-income countries. And only one of these is a non-English median country. So it's the usual suspects in terms of countries, and there's a real lack of imagination about other kinds of university, other models of university, and the different kinds of contribution that we can have. So we need to go beyond these rankings and thinking about other ways of understanding impact. The problem with the generic rankings is that even though they might be irrelevant for the vast majority of the 20 or so thousand higher education institutions in the world that aren't even listed, they provide a kind of a discursive influence that then shapes the way universities see themselves. The next factor is commercialization or commodification, marketization. The problem here, and this is a very well-known trend that we won't deal with in any great depth, but the challenge here, of course, is that we hollow out the public good ability of universities. If you're only thinking about income generation, it's very hard to develop that, the research and community engagement for public benefit. But also, of course, it restricts access to those who can pay, which also affects universities' ability to cater for the needs of the whole of their populations. And the final trend, which is much less talked about, is unbundling. And the idea of unbundling is that we start to separate out the constituent elements of the university. The most extreme form of unbundling is through MOOCs, which have developed rapidly in the last 10 years. They haven't brought the revolution that some might have expected, but the idea that we can provide online education, but not just the fact that it's online, but that we separate out the design of courses from the delivery and the evaluation which happens through these courses, that we separate out the teaching element of universities from research and community engagement, leads to a fragmentation of these processes, which can have significant impact for the ability of universities to promote the public good, including sustainable development. So those are some of the trends that are threatening the ability of universities to promote the SDGs. Moving on to the final part of the talk now. And here I think it's important to emphasize that while I have so far argued for the developmental university, we do need to think about the other models as well, and particularly the Humboldtian model. There is a danger, and this is one that was highlighted by Coleman, there is a danger in the developmental model that we might become too short-term and think only of application of knowledge. And I don't want to suggest that we need to get rid of the traditional university, the more blue skies kind of research, the curiosity-driven research, even some ivory tower reflection can be important. I think we need to retain an idea of the university that does provide a moment of a space of difference, an opportunity for reflection and for theory. Theory is important. It's not just about the practical and the applied notion of research. So I think we can retain the Humboldtian element there along with along with the developmental. But another very strong qualification on our endorsement of the developmental university is that it has a real blind spot when it comes to knowledge and culture. It's very much rooted in the Enlightenment Western model of knowledge. So the final thing that I want to say, and this links in with my point earlier about homogenization of higher education institutions, is a critique of the knowledge basis. And this will open up the beyond the SDGs part. I had a very interesting visit to the Universidad Veracruzana Intercultural in Mexico a few years ago that made me think in different ways about the SDGs. The students and staff who we engaged in there were working in quite different ways with development. They saw culture, language, and identity very much as part of the development process. There was a real sense of community work there, aspects that are very much absent in the SDGs. They also were founding their work on ideas of Buen Vivir or Sumac Causai, which is, if you're not familiar with it, is a philosophy of life that emerged in the Andean regions of but has spread to other parts of Latin America and beyond, which questions Enlightenment's separation of human beings from the rest of the natural world and the use of knowledge to exploit and accumulate, and looks to a harmony between people and between human beings and nature in a way that has some parallels with Ubuntu in Southern Africa, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And draws on other ideas of ecology of knowledges. The Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who I'm sure you've been working with as well, has written extensively on this idea that we need to think about an epistemic pluralism, different forms of knowing, not to replace the mainstream academic Western knowledge, but to sit alongside it and to be taken seriously. And it's this dimension that we need to bring into a critique of the SDGs, a critique of the lack of attention to culture, language, and identity, to community, and also the diversity of knowledge. And also to think about new forms of university. And this brings us back to my earlier point about a lack of imagination about the university. I think we need to think about not only strengthening the public good element of our mainstream university, but also think about a completely different kind of institution. We need to open our minds to different ways that higher education institutions might manifest themselves. And if you're looking for a very different model, try Universidad de la Tierra or Unitierra, again in Mexico. This is what we might think of as a post-development university. It breaks completely with the conventional structures of an education institution. It doesn't have professors, it doesn't have entrance requirements, it doesn't emit diplomas at the end of the day. It's a learning community for adults who are engaging in higher learning, so it shares that with a conventional university, but it steps away from all of the conventional trappings of the regulation and evaluation of learning that we've come to associate with universities in a way that can free us from many of our assumptions about the way that universities need to operate in today's world. And I argue that this is a fundamental part of achieving the SDGs and going beyond them, to allow space for this flowering of our diversity of different kinds of institutions, which of course have their challenges of resources and recognition, but are an essential part if we're going to achieve that. So I'll finish there and open it up for questions and discussion, and I'm very much looking forward to any perspectives that you have on these issues. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Tristan. So now we will open the for questions. I don't know if Miguel, how do you want to organize the questions?
It's called bate-papo.
Miguel?
Ok. Agora ativaste o som, eu estava sem o som ativado. So I think that we'll do as we did last time. This session was a very interesting session. I'm very happy to have Tristan here. Thank you very much. And but I have to give, I want to give voice to our students to ask questions first. I just want to put a very quick question, not question, but clarification. I would like very much if Tristan can show us the difference between the two rankings that he showed us and what are the different criteria that are being used. Okay, just that, and then I'll pass to our students. Can be like that, Rui?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, Tristan. The people who are watching us online, please on the chat, if you want to make a question, please put an X or ask to talk in the chat, and then I'll give you pass to you when they finish the students. It's up to you, Tristan. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I'll just clarify that. So, I mean, the international rankings have slightly different methodologies. The general world rankings, the big ones, Shanghai, QS, and Times Higher Education, measure things in a slightly different way. The Shanghai one is more narrowly research output focused, whereas the QS and Times Higher Education have more room for some different elements of teaching and reputation and so forth. But broadly speaking, they are evaluating the excellence of the institution. Right? The other one, the Times Higher Education Impact Ranking, is quite different. It focuses on the impact of those universities on the SDGs specifically. And the methodology is changing a little bit year to year, but they ask universities to report on a small number of the SDGs. So you can choose which ones you focus on, and then you report impact of your university on those different goals, whether it's climate action or gender equality or energy usage or terrestrial ecosystems or whatever it might be. So it's specifically about the SDGs. So it's quite an innovative ranking. It's had quite a lot of interest. I think, well, I don't want to be too cynical about it. I think it's an important development. And I think rankings aren't going anywhere soon. People love rankings. Even though they complain about them, we still look at them. So rankings aren't going anywhere. And I think it's an important thing to develop alternative rankings. I think that's probably the best way to go forward, because we're not going to get rid of them. So alternative rankings are a really important thing. And I don't want to be too cynical about Times Higher Education. I think they've done a good thing in developing this ranking, but it's far from perfect. And I think one of the reasons it's limited is that it's actually very difficult to report on your activities. Part of the reason that all of those top listed universities are in high income countries is that those universities have the resources and the administrative capacity to develop a nice narrative around what they're doing. You've got to collect lots of things. You've got to present it all. It takes quite a lot of administrative capacity to do that. I know lots of universities in Africa and Latin America that are doing fantastic things, but probably don't get around to reporting on what they're doing. You know, they're having huge positive impacts on their communities, but maybe Times Higher Education doesn't get to see that, right? So I think we need it. That's a difficult thing to get around in rankings as well. Not just doing the things, but actually showing and telling that you're doing them. Thanks for the question.
Miguel, peraí, estás sem som, Miguel. Wait. No, now you're live.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tristan. And it was very important to see the difference between rankings, and that it was important also that you mentioned that third leg of university, that is extension. It is going and working with communities, but as that is not shown in the rankings, so they are promoting only the academics, the professors, and less the knowledge and the using of knowledge. So thank you very much. And then, if Rui, you don't have any question.
No, you can go. Yeah.
In Bate-Papo, in the chat, we can ask our students if they have any question to pose. Please, you can come here. I don't know, just present yourself briefly and the name. And come on.
All right, hi. Can you hear me, Tristan? Yes. Yeah. Can you hear? All right, hi, my name is Deji from Nigeria. I really want to appreciate this particular information, or let me say knowledge, that you're giving us this morning. For everyone that has been here with me, they know that one of the issue I challenge basically in development education class is the fact that why the education system or framework has been designed to, or where I wouldn't say design, or why the education system has existed in such a way that the cultural preservation or the systematization of the culture, indigenous culture, is kind of displaced. So those are the things that I challenge, and I would just want to ask if you have any model or any framework you could suggest. I might not be able to generalize for the whole of Africa, but I think I can talk from my experience back from Nigeria. You only have contact with any education of your culture, let's say in the elementary school, or perhaps in the first 3 years of your secondary school. And then after that, if you're in the sciences, you have nothing to do with the culture. I mean, the heritage, there is nothing, even not the language. So over the years from elementary to high institution to postgraduate and everything, it's either in English, everything science, everything, either social science, even in social science, it's only people that do history or people that do linguistics that have a touch of indigenous education or cultural education in that sense. All right, so I want to ask, of course, you're talking about education development. So how do we get to that point, or what framework can you suggest, or what model can you advise that especially the West African countries can take to ensure that they incorporate cultural preservation or cultural knowledge kind of a thing, you know, into the system of education that operates? Because I believe that there is a way the culture or the language or the natural innate abilities in you can project how you interpret, how you analyze things and the like. But when these things are lost over the years in the course of you getting advanced education in what's it called, the so-called European system, kind of a thing, or Western education system, and then you are leaving that point of indigenous development. So which model can you suggest? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that question. That's a really excellent one. One of the most important challenges facing us. Yeah, the curriculum in universities worldwide is a particular one, and it does not generally reflect the different kinds of culture in societies. And I think it's important to highlight that it's not just a question of post-colonial societies as well. Even if you look at high-income countries that we might think of as dominant cultures, universities still marginalize cultures within those countries as well. So it's not just about between countries, it's also within countries. So I think it's a problem globally. And there's a question of culture. There's also a question of language. I think we don't talk very much about language in some countries it's a very big issue, but it's not always a prominent topic of international discussions on higher education. But the language question is a really critical one in universities. We have a kind of a pyramid where in the early years of primary education, there's quite a lot of language diversity, and in countries in West Africa, as you know, it's quite common for the first 3 years of primary education, or maybe the whole of primary education, if you're lucky, to be in a local language. Once you get to secondary, they start to drop out. And once you get to university, there are no local languages at all. The only language used is English or French or Portuguese or another one of the colonial languages, or elsewhere in the world. Of course, we can look at other ones, but very little diversity there. There are it's extreme, apart from if you are actually studying explicitly an African language, as part of an arts and humanities course. It's extremely rare that you would ever be able to use it. There are a few exceptions to that, but it's very rare. So I think the language question is crucial to that. But there's a more general one about curriculum and culture. And there have been huge movements that relate to this in recent years. So most obviously the decolonization debates in South Africa, the Rhodes Must Fall campaigns, which have spread from South Africa to other places. And there's a longer tradition of decolonization in Latin America, in universities and societies and so forth. So it's a very important movement. But the question that you've asked, I think, is what else can we be doing? What else can universities be doing? And that question is not often answered, even amongst those decolonization campaigns and movements and so forth. There isn't always a ready answer to, if we tear down if we tear the fabric, if we pull down the statue, what gets put up in its place? And that's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, there are some broad worldviews or philosophies of life that people are finding very useful as resources of inspiration and principles, such as I mentioned, Sumak Kausai or Buen Vivir in Latin America, or Ubuntu in Southern Africa. So these can provide a sort of intellectual inspiration and resources. But in constructing a practical educational model, there's still a lot of work to do. One of the ways to do that, of course, is just to allow for linguistic diversity, which, as I said, isn't happening. So it's a very concrete way that universities can start to do that, allowing the use of different languages in the university for teaching purposes. We also need to think about academic publishing, very English dominated, and beyond English, just a few other languages, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and a few others where you have international publication of any significant volume. But if we're thinking about the curriculum, I think there are sort of moderate, and then there are more radical ways of doing it. So I think some institutions are doing this in small ways that are a really good start. There are quite a few universities that have brought in, for example, kind of African studies modules, which are available for all students, not just those who've opted to do a full course in it. But let's say, I'll take, for example, of Ashesi University in Ghana, which is a really interesting, innovative, it's a private university, actually it's a liberal arts university. So all students who go there have to do some African studies modules to try and root people in local and regional cultures. And other universities have done similar things. But that's just a small step on a much longer path to real cultural and epistemic diversity in the institution. And that's much harder to achieve. We have some interesting models. There are indigenous universities in Latin America that are moving towards that in very interesting ways, but it's very hard to achieve. I was on a research project in Brazil where we came into contact with a very interesting model that never actually came to light because of the political shifts that took place in Brazil in recent years. But it presented a really interesting model of how you can do this, where the idea of this was to have a university for indigenous peoples in the Amazon that would combine Portuguese language with various indigenous languages, and it would also combine face-to-face with distance education in different parts. Right? So people don't need to dislocate from their communities, and also combined traditional university lecturers with community elders who had no formal qualifications. And I think it's that kind of hybrid model where you're not completely displacing mainstream academic knowledge, but you are allowing space for different kinds of expert, different languages and different models of learning that probably gives us the best way forward, I'd say. Thanks for the question.
Got my glasses.
The sound is on, Miguel. You're on.
Yeah, no. Thank you very much, Tristan. Thank you very, very much. Anyone else? Yeah. Come on.
Hello. Thank you very much. My name is Konstantinos. I am from Greece. It was a very interesting presentation. I would like to ask the following. Given the COVID-19 impact and the digital transformation that most of the educational systems are now experiencing, how does the university look like in 2035? And second, how countries with less financial resources can adjust to the new normal with having more digital education and more online education in general? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tristan?
Thanks for that. Yeah. Okay, so gazing in my crystal ball, some future predictions. 2035. Well, I suppose we probably will all be surprised again. No one predicted 2020. No one predicted 2016 and the shift to the right and so forth. So we're constantly surprised, and undoubtedly something will happen in 2025 again that's going to, throw things out again. But on current trajectories, clearly there's the big trends. Of course, there's a shift to online education and use of digital technologies of all sorts of types, but not only for purely online delivery, but blended models, and also incorporation of digital technologies within face-to-face provision as well. So learning metrics and so forth. So all sorts of incorporations of technology, and it would be very surprising if that trajectory were to lessen. Is that a bad thing? Well, you know, all forms of technology have moral and political bases. They're not intrinsically good or bad. It's about the way that we use them, and I think that's exactly the same with digital technologies. If we step outside of, I think what we have to avoid is, on the one hand, a kind of a reactionary conservatism that any new way of doing things is bad, but we also need to avoid a kind of a sort of jubilant Silicon Valley kind of romanticism that anything that's technological is good and desirable. Okay, so if we step outside of both of those positions, which are not based in evidence or reflection, you know, I think we can see some potentially positive and potentially negative aspects. So I think on the plus side, it's undeniable that you know, distance education, online education can expand the reach of higher education. There are some vast open online universities in the Indian subcontinent. In India, Pakistan, there are open universities there that have millions, I mean, literally millions of students. Okay. So there is in a ways that wouldn't be possible in face-to-face. There are people in very remote regions, for example, in the Amazon. The Open University of Brazil can reach people in very remote areas who wouldn't be able to come to face-to-face, or if they did, they would have to leave their communities and not go back. So there's the simple question of distance, and COVID, of course, has brought that to the fore. You know, we've been able to carry on our work and our learning to some degree, at least, because of this technology. There is also another aspect of this which I think is really promising, and that's the potential for collaboration and co-construction. And here the Wikipedia model is sort of best known. The idea that against everyone's expectations, you can, with no financial incentive and no real reward at all, just intrinsic motivations, people could collaboratively construct a complete encyclopedia, which is fairly reliable. Not always reliable, but it's fairly reliable. And it's open access, and it's an incredibly useful resource which all of us use. So this is a very exciting thing that actually, you know, we can undermine the exclusive dimensions of capitalism through technology. So I think there are some positives there. But of course, there are some risks. And as we all know, the internet opens up possibilities of collaboration, but it also closes them down. And it's also a way of exploiting people, manipulating them. And if we're thinking of higher education specifically, technology hasn't led to a democratization of all aspects of the process. There's certainly been a democratization of information, and even that within limits. The digital divide means that not everyone in the globe can even log in and get access to Wikipedia, right? But there has been an expansion of access to information. But information is one thing, learning is another. And to learn meaningfully and to become educated, normally we need interaction, we need engagement, we need good teachers, we need interaction with peers who can help us. And that isn't so easy to come by. And it can lead to a kind of a vicious cycle where people who've had quite poor quality primary and secondary education then don't necessarily have the learning autonomy and skills to be able to be autonomous when they have a MOOC or other kind of online provision. But there's a final element to emphasize there, and that's the positional element. Regardless of learning and knowledge, there's still a kind of an exclusive dimension to higher education, the sort of Rolex element, right? If everyone could have a degree from Yale, Princeton, Stanford, and Harvard, then it wouldn't be worth so much anymore. So there's an extent to which these universities have to restrict access in order to maintain the value of their product. And universities all around the world function in this kind of way. You only really get the fruits of the degree in the labor market through an exclusive diploma that not everybody can have access to. And I think we have to recall that positional aspect of higher education. That's not going anywhere soon. So we might see a partial democratization, but we're still going to have that exclusive element that reproduces inequalities.
Thank you very much, Tristan. Thank you very much. It was it was a very interesting answer. Thank you very much. I think that we have a last question. Two last questions, three. So please raise the hand to ask questions. 1, 2, 3. We have 3 last questions. Can we?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very brief.
Very brief. Thank you very much, Rui. So I will start with who wants to go in the last.
Shall I take them? Shall I take the questions all together?
Sorry?
Shall I take all 3 questions together?
Together, yeah. Come. You can come here. No, first he come, then you come, and then Sylvia come, and then he gets all 3 questions, and then Tristan will answer the 3 in a row. So please, a question, please, Mr. Wu. A question.
Yes. Okay. Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank you for this amazing presentation. My name is Niaina. I'm from Madagascar. And my question is more related to the SDGs, in the sense that you mentioned in the presentation that it's the sustainable development is a contested concept, and while it has become the frame of development policies in all around the world. So my question is well, if it is a contested concept, and if it's more applied to sustainable development goals is a framework that is applied all over the world. My question is, how is the SDG goals themselves and the way they are being applied in Africa actually sort of impact? Could they kind of impact or hinder the development situation in Africa? Are the SDGs more compatible in certain regions than other regions, in certain regions of the globe than other regions? And are they, because we're talking about the SDGs are something from policies that were taken outside of the African continent, and they're applied everywhere else, and also the African continent has to follow them, the policies, and most of the international organizations and actors, actually their policies in Africa are oriented toward attaining, toward the goal to attain the sustainable development goals. But so my question is, does it actually really is it actually compatible with the African framework model of development? Thank you.
Next one, Sylvia, if you don't mind, you are closer.
Okay. Hello, good morning. I'm Silvia from Italy. My question is, I would like to ask you to make a reflection or state your opinion based on your experience and research. How do you see the political role of universities, higher institutions, and their networks in the environmental revolution?
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Thank you. Mr. Lucas.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. In the political role of universities in what?
The environmental revolution.
Can you explain what that is?
For example, I'm thinking about Fridays for Future and the social movements, but especially I would like to focus on the political role, because how is it possible that we still have people who don't believe in climate change, how to speak truth to power, and all these kind of topics. Thank you.
Mr. Lucas, please. Thank you, Nick.
Good morning, Tristan. First of all, thank you for the presentation. Very enlightening in a lot of ways. My question regards culture, language, and higher institutions. And what I'm thinking and asking is more like, if academia created is such a traditional institution, so to say, and it has developed for such a period of time, why do we as academicians so much need to adapt to another language as English that is more universal, and we don't have such a tradition in translating and adapting articles? It has its problems with adaptation, but you know, we don't see as much higher education institutions playing that such a role of translating to present to their students better some contents. So in a sense, you get restricted to what you can actually understand. And that goes from colonial languages to indigenous languages. So I think that's my question. Why does academia didn't create such a tradition of translating?
And Lucas is from Brazil.
Yes, I am.
So thank you very much. Tristan, if you can give us quick three. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for those questions as well. It's a really interesting group. I'm sure you're having some amazing discussions in class. So thanks for those points, quite diverse ones there. So the first one is SDGs, and are they compatible in Africa? Well, I suppose, you know, we're dealing with lots of different levels here. We're dealing with the different governments, their interactions with the international sphere, and all sorts of different communities. And I suppose the answer to that is quite different depending. I mean, there are some interesting studies actually that have looked at the MDGs and other global frameworks, and moving on to the SDGs, and how these things filter down through different levels. So it's a very complex aspect. And to be fair, the SDGs are a global framework endorsed by the United Nations. So it's top down, but they did make a real effort to be consultative. So there was a long process of getting different views from all around the world, all sorts of different constituencies. So they really tried to avoid, a little committee deciding something and then spreading it around to everyone. Whether they achieved that, well, that's a different matter. And of course, no one's going to be happy with the 17 goals. At least not completely happy. And everyone wants to push their own areas, and you can never satisfy everybody. But they did try. But at the end of the day, it's very hard to have a global framework that is really responsive to all of those local views. So I think what you have is a situation where governments do, particularly in countries which have high levels of cooperation with external agencies and rely to some degree on international agencies and aid flows, there ends up being a process of adapting to the new discourse and language. So I think there is an extent to which governments have, realigned themselves towards the SDGs in order to attract various funding flows and in order to comply with the different requirements of aid. So that there might be some impact on that, although it might be simply a question of old wine in new bottles. So quite a lot of the time, there's simply a repackaging of existing work. And of course, countries don't suddenly start trying to gain social and environmental impact because the SDGs arrive. It's the same with universities. Universities have been doing a lot of these things for decades. Sometimes you can have things sort of linked in with a new framework, but they're actually pre-existing. The second question, the political role of universities in relation to the environmental revolution. Universities have always had a very strong political dimension because you have large numbers of people, young people and older people with time to reflect on the situation of their countries and the situation of the globe, to interact with one another and gain solidarity through that interaction. Also, to some degree, to interact across diversity, which can also increase the sense of a mission towards justice, and with some time to do something about it. Because, of course, a lot of political action is neutralized by the fact that people are so immersed in the daily struggle that they don't have very much spare time to actually campaign. So all of those things have meant that universities are extremely well placed for that. And there have been lots of instances in history of university students, particularly, and to some degree staff as well, being key revolutionary actors. And I think that's no exception when it comes to the environmental revolution. Rebellions, Extinction Rebellion, for example, and the Greta Thunberg, although of course that's a secondary school movement, but of course involving universities as well. It's an interesting one in terms of the intentional work of universities, though, because to some degree these are things that happen organically. I think if universities were to plan for this kind of thing, they might just get in the way, To some degree, I think, with their staff and students, I think, you create conditions in universities and you try not to prevent students from expressing their political actions, I think. If you try to plan for these things, I'm not sure it would actually help very much. So I think the best posture that universities can have is to nurture bottom-up initiatives, not to necessarily, plan and construct them from the center, but to allow space for students. I think that's the key things, to allow spaces in campuses or digital interactions for students to be able to pursue, to meet together, to discuss, to develop their political consciousness, and not to prevent them from engaging in political mobilizations is probably the best posture. And the last question, just something on the translating role of universities. Yeah, I mean, higher education systems have always had a kind of a translocational element. So they've always been fairly international or cross-cultural institutions, and not just European universities. So I understand, I mean, there's a fascinating Indian university called Nalanda that was functioning about 1,000 years ago. They have actually tried to revive it, but it was destroyed about 800 years ago. It was probably the most important university in the world at the time. And the students at Nalanda came from all the way across Asia, from all the way from Turkey, all the way through to Japan. So you've got this giant international institution. The European universities in medieval times were very international. So I think at all periods of history until the present moment, of course, when there's been a real resurgence of internationalization, of which your course is a good example, there's been this kind of international, global perhaps, or cross-cultural dimension to universities. And of course, that means that lingua franca start to develop in university, because you've got to communicate in some way. And we can have a kind of a translanguaging form of communication. So sometimes we can do that. I imagine on, you know, in your course, there's a degree of translanguaging going on because some people speak some languages. You know, in Latin America, there's quite a lot of Portuñol spoken, so you can shift between languages sometimes, but there is a tendency to use single languages that can function as a lingua franca and allows everyone to communicate on that basis. And Greek had that function, Latin had that function for a long time, Arabic has had that function, certain parts of the world. So there are different kinds of lingua franca, but obviously English is the preeminent lingua franca for global academia in today's world. There are some other small lingua franca. So there's a degree to which that is inevitable. In some ways, it's a good thing because, of course, it does allow for communication on an international level. But it starts to be pernicious or even poisonous when the lingua franca starts to undermine the other languages. And I think that's the real problem that we have at the moment. It's not the existence of a lingua franca, which has its place and can be a good thing. It's when it starts to displace and undermine and prevent other languages from being used in the university space. And I think what we really need to avoid is having non-English languages and local languages being kind of okay for the home and okay for primary schools, but not good enough for universities. That's a really dangerous situation. We need to have a university sphere where multiple languages are used at that high level for university teaching and also for academic publication and research. We need to get to a genuinely kind of multilingual situation, even if we decide to use some of those languages for cross-linguistic communication as well. So that's all. Thanks very much for those great questions and for the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Tristan. We are out of time, as you notice. Just want to thank again Tristan and all the people who were participating in this lecture, and hope see you guys soon in another opportunity. Thanks a lot, Tristan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Rui also.
Bye.
See you again.
See you.
Thank you.